Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out some Catherine Maria Sedgwick. It's edited by Mary Kelly. So we're just going to start with the introduction. Here we go. In a letter written on October 5th, 1851, Catherine Maria Sedgwick responded to a proposal made by William Minot, the husband of Sedgwick's beloved niece and namesake Kate. William had suggested that Sedgwick, a national acclaimed author of novels, tales, and sketches, undertake her autobiography. Had William appealed on her on the basis of her literary achievements, this invertedly modest woman almost certainly would have declined. Not surprisingly, when William asked that the autobiography be written for his Kate's daughter, Alice, a child to whom Sedgwick was devoted, nonetheless, the project seemed daunting. A woman who had remained unmarried despite the protestations of suitors, Sedgwick told William she had boarded round so much, had my home in so many houses and so many hearts, indeed, had her life so woven into the fabric of others, that I seemed to have had no separate individual existence. Nowhere else in the entire body of Sedgwick's writings did she reveal more about the character of her richly textured relationships with her parents, her brothers, her sisters, her nieces and nephews. Nowhere else did the signal more strikingly the impact these relationships had upon her sense of self. Ironically, this conception of herself as intertwined with the lives of those whom she cherished also meant that she would not refuse William's request, and she would consider it a filial duty. Telling him that perhaps I might tell a story and pleasant story to my darling Alice, Sedgwick displayed her typical modesty. Just as typically, she achieved more than she promised in her autobiography of a childhood and adolescence that had spanned the opening years of her early republic. Gathering together the threads of memory, Sedgwick wove deeply a deep personal narrative with an illuminating portrayal of the newly independent America. Sedgwick also kept a journal throughout much of her adulthood, beginning with entries that she made in the summer of 1821. When she was 31, Sedgwick filmed 12 volumes with meditation upon the author as an adult and the world she shared with her antebellum Americans. Taken together, the autobiography and the journal constitute her self-representation, child to adult. No less, they offer readers a representation of both the changes and the continuancies characterizing relations of power in the decades between American Revolution and its Civil War. More than a century before historians did so, Sedgwick situated power in its broadest context. Her autobiography and journal extended the meaning of power to include general relations of a central dimension. They addressed with equal insight social and political relations. Ranked with Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and William Cullen Bryant as the founder of our nation's literature, Sedgwick published 6 novels and nearly 100 tales and sketches of a career that spanned the 4 decades before the Civil War, ranging from a revisionary portrayal of the conflict between Puritans and the Indians to a dissection of the Jacksonian American dominated by commercialism. Sedgwick's fiction was dealt with issues that were decidedly social and political in character, portrayals of reform movements, discourses in class relations, doctrines, debates between Congressionalists and Unitarians. All these issues and more were interwoven into a body of literature that spoke into the felt realities of early 19th century Americans. Equal concern was its issues of gender. Sedgwick placed strong independence and articulate heroines at the center of her fiction. Sedgwick's model of gender relations presumed different roles for women and men. Nonetheless, she accorded women signal status as central social and cultural actors. In the opening sentence of her autobiography, Sedgwick described the project as a collection of memories. Begun in the 64th year of her life, Sedgwick's autobiography was, in the narrowest sense, exactly that, a commemorative text designed to inscribe the past upon the present. However, the design, the effort to brighten the links of the chains that bind us to those who have gone before and to keep it fast and strong had significance beyond this objective. Perhaps most important, Sedgwick departed from an autobiographical tradition in which she moved inexorably towards separation and individuation. In sanctioning connection and stressing reciprocal comment, Sedgwick stood in contrast to other notable American autobiographers such as Benjamin Franklin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry Adams, each of whom presented the self on a trajectory toward autonomy. Sedgwick's emphasis upon identity, constructed in relation to others, located her narrative in an alternative tradition initiated by the 14th century Englishman Dame Julian of Norwich. Julian's Revelations, Marjorie Kemp's 5th century book of Marjorie Kemp, and Margaret Cavendish's The True Relation 2 centuries later all define the self in relation to others. New Englander Anne Bradstreet inscribed the same relational self in her 17th century to my dear children. So too did Sedgwick in the middle of her 19th century. Just as the self that Sedgwick presented to Alice had taken its shape from the individual circumstances of her life and the larger social and cultural milieus in early 19th century America, so Sedgwick herself shaped those sources in the presentation of her childhood and adolescence. Born in Stockbridge, Massachusetts on December 28, 1789, Catherine Maria was the third daughter and sixth child of Theodore and Pamela Dwight Sedgwick, descended from one of the most distinguished families in the Connecticut River Valley. Pamela Dwight married Theodore Sedgwick in 1774. She had chosen a husband who rapidly achieved the standing of her parents, the socially prominent Joseph and Abigail Dwight. Theodore's election to both houses in the Massachusetts legislature made the Sedgwicks a leading family in the state prior to their daughter's birth. The next decade brought national distinction. Election to the United States House of Representatives, in which he served as Speaker, and the Senate, Theodore became one of the early Republic's most influential Federalists. His proud daughter recalled that Theodore and his allies in the Federal Party loved their country and were devoted to it, as virtuous parents are to their children. However, much of these powerful Federalists may have dedicated to their nation, they found their claims to leadership in the newly independent America challenged by those who sought a mere egalitarian society. The hierarchy, the finely graded stratification, and the deference to a gentlemanly elite that had prevailed in the colonial society no longer seemed secure. In the description of her mother's parents, Sedgwick illustrated the contrast between the earlier world and the one being born in the years following the American Revolution. A gentleman par excellence of his time, Joseph Dwight had been a highly successful lawyer and land speculator in the Connecticut River Valley. One of Stockbridge's prominent residents and trustee of its Indian school, Joseph's status had been conveyed to posterity in a painting that displayed his most delicately beautiful hands. Sedgwick presumed that her grandfather had simply wanted to show his descendants that he had kept clean hands and a commendable virtue, physically and morally speaking. Perhaps he did, but those hands had more of an immediate purpose for Joseph, serving as an emblem for the dividing and separating a member of the elite from the rest of the contemporaries. Virtually everything about Abigail Dwight had performed the same service, described the terms of reality, imaginable signifiers of status. The woman who shared in the management of the Indian school was dignified, benevolent, and pleasing. Like in the hands of her husband, displaced, the apparel that Abigail donned confirmed her social standing. The dress of rich silk, a high-crowned cap with plaited border, and a watch that so seldom worn as in a distinction all marked the gentleman and inspired respect. In the midst of the transformation that was altering their nation's social and political premises, the pre-revolutionary elite continued to defend their prerogatives that had set Joseph and Abigail apart. However, the markers of the Sedgwicks, described in her autobiography, was now subject to challenge, infuriating. The forms of deference, signifying a hierarchical society, was being cast aside. Theodore Sedgwick, brow and lowered from the embroidered artisans, presented themselves at the front door of his home. He did move, then Glower, then the still more presumptuous representative of that coming order, stood at the same door and refused to move his hat. This lad had been forcibly removed by the elder Sedgwick, albeit with the hat still secure on his head. Clearly, at his daughter's remarkably wry, Theodore had been born too soon to relish the freedom of democracy. might be said for Pamela Sedgwick. She had insisted that the family and the servants be segregated. Household help, Catharine recalled, had been restricted to the kitchen table. Sedgwick's recollections had documented the increasing resistance of Pamela's practice. Now Catharine and a real resident, when the young Sedgwick had been said to recruit the woman's daughter for a servant. We are made out of the same clay. We have got one maker and one judge, and we have got to lay down in the grave side by side. Why can't you sit down to the table together? The conflict between these defending the old order and their challengers took on a political cast in the competition between the nation's parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The political party of loyal Federalists, Theodore, bore all the marks of a party committed to the maintenance of the traditional hierarchy, a paternalistic approach to politics, a belief that only elite leadership could sustain the nation, and haughty distrust of the lower orders. Theodore's comment on the Republican experience was not the issue. Service as a legislator in the Massachusetts General Court, leadership in the nation's Congress, and tenure on the Massachusetts Supreme Court all testified to the dedication to the Republican government found under the Constitution. Instead, was the very meaning of the republicanism that was being contested during the 3 decades of Theodore's career. Sedgwick recalled that her father was other prominent Federalists hoped a republic might exist and prosper. Indeed, they entered the hope that it might be the happiest government in the world, but not without a strong aristocratic element. It was the last reservation, that insistence upon a strong aristocratic element, that separated leading Federalists from those dedicated to a republicanism in which all of the enfranchised played a role in the conduct of politics. The Federalists' opposition to increased popular participation was informed by their allegiance to the traditional social structure that divided the world into gentlemen and lower orders. Men like Theodore, who identified all sound principles, truth, justice, and patriotism, was a gentleman elite, had no truck with the lower order, at least as political entities. They, as Sedgwick recalled, were dismissed by her father as Jacobins, sans culottes, and miscreants. Theodore's epithets notwithstanding, he surely recognized, as his daughter did, that the forces opposing him proposed an intense desire to grasp the power and place that had been denied to them, in a determination to work out the theories of the government. With the election of 1800, Theodore believed that he had accomplished exactly that. The defeat of his party at the polls and the rejection of the republicanism which he identified led Theodore to resign his congressional seat. Still in control of Massachusetts, the Federalists appointed him to the state's highest court. Disillusioned but still eager to wield influence, he remained there until his death in 1813. Despite the highly publicized hostility between the rival parties, Theodore's daughter suggested that the politics had a lighter side, and despite Theodore's sober sense of purpose, his daughter caught the pranks, the lampoons, and the unpretentious humor of the times. She recorded these memories in her autobiography. They also became the subject of a reminiscence of federalism, a story Sedgwick based upon a summer she spent in Bennington, Vermont during the last decade of the 18th century. Bennington's Main Street, as she noted in her autobiography, extended a long way, some mile and a half from the hill at one end to the plain of the other, and it was there that the village residents were likely to find Clover, an old horse who had been left to graze. Clover was no ordinary host. His distinction was that his superannuated sides had been pasted over with lampoons in which the rival factions vented their wit over their malignity, safe from personal responsibility, for Clover could tell no tales. Daily, however, indeed, Clover trudged from the hill, a walking gazette, his ragged and grizzled sides covered with the militant missives, and returned bearing the responses of his valley, as unconscious as his hostile burden, as the mail of its portentous contents. In his story, which she published in 1835, Sedgwick allowed one Democratic Republican to voice his opinion that distrust of the people was a great error of the Federalists. The narrative response that the respective will be now perhaps be admitted with the truth. Sedgwick had come to the same opinion only with her adulthood. The younger Sedgwick, as she readily admitted in her autobiography, had aligned herself with her father, looking upon every member of the opposition as grasping, dishonest, and vulgar. Every member of the rival party had been cast as an enemy to her country. The hierarchy and deference under assault in the social and political relations of the early republic had also characterized gender relations in colonial society. Whether gentlemen or members of the lower orders, a woman had been considered a man's subordinate. In a hierarchy that divided the world into the feminine and the masculine, a woman had been expected to defer to male authority in the household and the world beyond its doors. Many of the underpinnings of the system remained intact in the years after the Revolution. Women were still subject to coverture, a legal tradition that submerged a wife's property to her husband's. They were still dependent, denied participation in the nation's body politic, either as voters or as jurors. Simultaneously, however, subtle but discernible changes were becoming evident. Enhanced opportunities for female education began to erase the disparity of literacy between white women and white men, building upon the basic literacy taught in public schools. An increasing number of private academies and seminaries provided a woman a more extended and diversified education. Republican motherhood and ideology that described political significance to domestic responsibilities made women's education critical to the survival of the newly independent nation. Expected to foster the necessary elements of virtue in their sons and encouraging the same in their husbands, the mother and wives became the educators of their nation's citizens. The fulfilling this obligation, women participated, albeit indirectly, in civil and political life. Standing as an archetype of gender relations, the institution of marriage considered continuity and change in the early republic. Women did remain subject to the interesting strands of subordination and authority that had marked colonial marriages. Nonetheless, the practice of more egalitarian relations in such households signaled the modifications in this pattern. Not least, the idea of a woman might remain unmarried and still have a meaningful life was glimpsed as a possibility. Within a generation, Catharine Maria Sedgwick counted herself among the women who made that idea a reality. Here we will leave the introduction for more for tomorrow that we're learning here from Catharine Sedgwick and from Miss Kelly, the author of the introduction. So if there's anything truth or like to what I'm saying, please enjoy and have a nice day.